but that's what they did. Women, I mentioned the women. There's some horror stories here too. The women were sent out on some of these ships that were nicknamed floating brothels. The crew, and indeed some of the convicts, were given right to have their way with these women in any way they wanted. Extraordinary stories. In fact, there's one story of a ship that went out, one of these so-called floating brothels. Instead of 7 months to get to Australia, it took 15 months because the sailors and the officers kept delaying the journey so they could continue abusing the women. Once again, horror stories. When the women got here, I should say, you might think this is smart and strange. This is from the 1800 mark. Women could be transported, we call it mooning, but for showing their buttocks to a minister or naming a clergyman in a paternity case, they had terrible situations. So this is from a magazine illustrating that. But when the women got to Australia, they were sent to what was called a female factory. That's the one at Parramatta, about 14 miles out of Sydney. It still exists, the building. The women were put in there like a workhouse. So they did washing, knitting, sewing for the colony. So it wasn't, when the convicts first arrived, they didn't get a uniform. You may have seen illustrations of them with these broad arrows on them. That didn't come till much later, when Governor Macquarie arrived in Australia and took over the convict system. This was a pretty hideous thing to do as well. This was convicts who were made to do public works, build buildings, do road works, and they really were yoked to the plough like horses and made to do extraordinary amounts of work. If you were lucky, you'd get on a road gang, they called it, which was far better than being on one of these where your ankles were chained at the same time. I mean, must have been a shocker. This is the cat o' nine tails. You can see how vicious it would be. This, well, when the convicts were given a sentence of with the cat o' nine tails, they probably started the Australian sense of humour. They used to refer to it as getting a new red shirt. This, another horrific treatment for convicts, was the treadmill. We had 5 of these in Sydney, and basically you just keep walking and walking and walking, and it turned a big wheel, which they used to irrigate water, to move water around, to grind corn and maize and so forth. The convicts used to refer to that as their dancing academy. Oh, you're going to the dancing academy, are you? Here's one in Tasmania that still exists. This one was underground. I mean, it's pretty horrible. In Tasmania and in Norfolk Island, off the coast of East Coast, they used to send convicts down mines. Now, Tasmania gets very cold, and they were working up to their waists in water, chipping the rocks to get mercury, because mercury was used to treat syphilis, and syphilis was a major problem right throughout the world, and especially in the maritime industries. And so these poor devils would be down working in these mines under this freezing cold water, and their life expectancy was usually around 3 months, and they were gone. That's that triangle I mentioned there that they tied them to. That's a depiction of somebody getting the life bashed out of them. One of the worst was Queensland. Moreton Bay, that's the bay around Brisbane. That had a horror story because the captain there, Captain Logan, was particularly savage with his convicts and was much hated. And eventually he got speared by 2 Aboriginal people when he went on some sort of exploratory journey up the river, and it caused great celebration amongst the convicts. There's a song that came out of that. I'll give it a go. I'll croak along. It's called Moreton Bay, and it mentions Captain Logan and being speared. One Sunday morning as I went walking by Brisbane waters, I chanced to stray. I heard a convict his fate bewailing as on that sunny river bank he lay. I am a native of Erin's Island and lately banished from me native shore. They took me from my aged parents and from the girl who I do adore. For 3 long years I was beastly treated, heavy irons on my legs I wore. My back from flogging it was beastly treated, and oft times crimson with my bloody gore. But for all those places of condemnation, those penal settlements of New South Wales, to Moreton Bay I do know no equal. Excessive tyranny each day prevails. Like the Egyptians and native Hebrews, like Erin's Island I did bequeath, till a native black laying there in ambush did deal to Logan, yes, his mortal stroke. My fellow prisoners be exhilarated that all such monsters such a fate may find, and when from freedom we are liberated, all thoughts of suffering may they flee from your mind. Something like that. The last convicts were transported here, as I said, in 1867. They were mainly Irish, and they were sent to West Australia, which was pretty late on taking convicts. South Australia never took any convicts. So it was, and the reason for that is that they had declared and voted as a colony not to take convicts. They wanted to be this utopian society, goodwill to all men and so forth. And so that's the only part of Australia that didn't get convicts. Just out of Sydney, there was an island called Cockatoo Island. I don't know if you saw that. Just one of those little islands there. That was one big jail. And the governor decreed that they wanted to bring the convicts down from Norfolk Island and put them somewhere close to Sydney so that they could do some work. So they chose this little island and they built 5 wheat silos, big things. And they used to get the men to go up there and pour the wheat in. And there's a report of 2 men falling in. And they just sort of like, well, you can imagine swimming in wheat. They just sank to the bottom. So they sent another 3 convicts in to rescue them, and they also died. So they ended up closing that silo, and it was another tragic story in that whole episode. Now, there was a man called Francis McNamara, the type of people that came out here. Francis Greenway was an architect, a convict, sentenced to come here for 14 years. He ended up being a wonderful architect, and some of our early buildings in Sydney were designed by this Francis Greenway. There was this other character called Francis McNamara, an Irishman, who was a forger. He came out here, and he had a terrible time because he was obviously not prepared to listen to British authority. In 8 years, he was flogged no less than 14 times, receiving a total of 650 lashes. In addition to these punishments, he served a total of 3.5 years of hard labour in the iron chain gangs, okay, with a chain on his ankle. And then he worked down in the Woolloomooloo quarries. We went past Woolloomooloo as we sailed out, and he had 13 days of solitary confinement, and in 2 sentences, 3 months on that treadmill. 3 months. So they'd do 3 hours, take them off for an hour, 3 hours, take them off for an hour. But can you imagine doing that for 3 months and keeping your sanity? He did. He escaped. Now, convicts did escape. They did. They just shot through into the bush. Many of them went north. They had this foolhardy idea that China was 20 miles north of Sydney. So they'd go up to the Hawkesbury, and of course China wasn't 20 miles from Sydney, but what they did find is starvation, usually. In a couple of occasions, people wandered off into the bush. There was a man called William Buckley who was down in Victoria, where we're headed now. He went into the bush and he lived with the Aborigines. He grew a big beard. He looked like an Aborigine. He got on very well with them, and he went for 30 months living with them, and one day he strolled back into camp with his Aboriginal friends, and the governor couldn't believe that anybody could actually live with the Aboriginal people and survive, but he did. When the people were good in the system, they were given a ticket of leave. This is what it looked like. This was basically to say, you've served your time, here is official proof that you're a free man. And sometimes they could go and get a small plot of land. Sometimes they could get permission to go to the female factory, and where the women were lined up every Thursday, they were supposed to do their hair and clean themselves up, and they'd parade them out. And if a settler, a free man, wanted a wife, he could point at somebody and say, she'll do. She had the right to say, jump in the lake or go away. But in most cases, these women, they also wanted to escape the system. So there were lots of pairings of released convicts and these women. So did the system work? It did work. The system worked very well because, as I said, healthy living, better food, sunshine, and people started to get bigger. People married, and for a long time, we were very embarrassed about revealing we had any convict heritage. There's about 2 million people in Australia can trace themselves to convict ancestry. And it's a big thing these days. People love to do that. They never used to mention it. They used to say the convict stain. You never mention the convict stain. When we had our bicentenary in 1988, people brought their convict heritage out from the cupboards and celebrated it. And today, people are very proud of the fact that they had convict for